so I finally saw Spider-Man No Way Home, and I thought it was good. This is by far my favourite of the Holland Spider-Man films, and it definitely is the best MCU movie since Endgame. Now, it's definitely not all good. I did not like the first 30 to 40 minutes of this film. It wasn't terrible, but it just rushed through all the stuff that we wanted to see with Peter Parker's identity being revealed. There was no courtroom with Netflix's very own Matt Murdock as his lawyer. Peter just gets questioned once, and then Matt Murdock shows up at his house and says, "Yeah, don't worry, I know you're being accused of murder, but this will pass and you'll be fine." That's not how this works. I mean, have the writers of this movie watched the scene in Daredevil Season 3 when a dead man gives a confession?
The court says that a person who believes that they're dying has less incentive to lie. Therefore, anything they say is...
You're telling me this is admissible in court?
Every damn word.
So Peter being accused of murder would not be so easily swept up, but this movie just brushes it off because I can only presume that Marvel don't know how to do a story like this justice, so they just threw that storyline away as quickly as possible and then tried to distract us with nostalgia. Well done nostalgia, but nostalgia nonetheless. So that storyline was completely botched. But once we see the villains come in, that's when the movie starts to get interesting. The two villains that were the best was Alfred Molina as Dr. Octopus and Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin. These two were great in every scene they were in, especially Willem Dafoe. He was the best actor in this movie, and his performance, I would dare say, is too good for the MCU. The way he contorts his face into a big smile and laughs even when he's being punched, it's really freaky and is something that the MCU would never ever do. But Dafoe, he did it regardless, and he really reminds you of how much of an amazing actor he is. And whereas I can pick flaws with every other actor's character or writing in this movie, I had zero complaints with his character as well as the writing for his character. In terms of character accuracy, he was a 10 out of 10, and he was very true to what his character was in the original movie. And he brought the darkest elements to this film and really put Peter through the ringer. And it speaks volumes that it took a villain from the original Spider-Man movies to do that. I even really like Tom Holland in this movie. This definitely fixes the problems that I had with him all this time. In this movie, he finally goes through a tragedy, he finally starts to take responsibility for his own screw-ups, and he even makes a huge sacrifice to fix it. He also finally learns with great power comes great responsibility, although I didn't 100% like the way it was told to him. It felt very last minute and quite rushed at the same time, but it was still better than what philosophy he had before, which was, "I want to be an Avenger, man." Speaking of which, the Avengers were only mentioned once in this movie, and I was so happy about that, because Tom Holland was finally able to have his own Spider-Man movie and not an MCU movie, which is exactly what Homecoming and Far From Home felt like. This felt like a Spider-Man movie, and it massively benefited because of it. It also benefited from being what I always wanted in the MCU, which is a much more serious movie that has tension and stakes. And in many ways, a lot of the criticisms I had towards the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies have been addressed here. Now, they weren't fixed 100%, but they were definitely addressed, mainly in the last half of this movie. And just like the last time, I thought that both he and MJ were a very cute couple, and I liked them more this time round. And Ned was given something to do, but again, he is still a comic relief that I could do without. But I did like him better than I did in the previous two movies. And the movie did get a tear out of me, which is the first for an MCU movie that was not directed by the Russo brothers. But again, if the previous two Spider-Man movies were better, then the scene would have been so much more tragic and I would have shed a lot more than just one tear. I also thought this movie had the best action of the three Holland Spider-Man films. The best action scene was the battle between the Green Goblin and Holland Spider-Man. That fight was brutal and it really showed how creepy Willem Dafoe's Goblin is, especially when Peter kept punching him and he just kept laughing. It almost felt like a less violent version of the scene in Smallville where Clark keeps punching Lex Luthor, only Willem Dafoe was putting on a much creepier face. The second best action scene was Peter's fight with Doctor Strange. The rest of the action to me was just okay. I was very disappointed by the final action scene in the climax. It just felt like it was rushed and very quickly edited and thrown together. It felt like it needed more time in the editing room, but instead they just rushed it to meet their release date. And yes, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were in this movie, and they weren't as bad as I thought they were going to be, but having said that, they felt very off. They made certain jokes that felt very MCU, and I know they would never say, such as Tobey Maguire's Peter making light of his best friend Harry's death and making it sound like a joke rather than a tragedy. And Garfield made some bad jokes as well that he would never have made. The most awkward one was when he said, "I love you guys." This should have been saved for an emotional moment towards the end of the film after they had bonded, like Into the Spider-Verse did with its Spider-Mans. But instead, this movie decided to take the opportunity to make an awkward joke out of it instead, and no one in the cinema laughed. I'll go more into detail detail in the versus video, but in terms of character accuracy, Tobey Maguire gets a 3 out of 10 and Garfield gets a 6. There was definite enjoyment to be had with seeing them on screen, especially when they reference the people they lost in their lives, but both characters don't feel like the characters that we know and love from their own movies. They are Disney Marvel versions of those characters, and as cool as it is to see these actors play these roles after all these years, once the novelty wears off, I am certain that everyone will see the flaws in their portrayals, and I do wish that the MCU would have done them better, because if they did, then seeing them in the movie would have been so much better than it ended up being. This movie also had some really questionable editing, and yes, this movie has a lot of jokes in general that don't work. Now thankfully, the jokes don't interrupt a serious or sad moment, but it's very noticeable when the movie thinks it's telling a funny joke and leaves a pause for the audience to laugh, and then no one in the audience laughs. 80% of the jokes didn't work for me, and 70% of the movie's dialogue did feel like a childish Saturday morning cartoon, particularly when the villains bicker. And that's a shame, because I honestly think that the other 30% of the dialogue demonstrated that it could have been more than that. Going back to a positive note, the ending to this movie was very ballsy and grim. So much so that if Sony wanted to take Tom Holland out of the MCU, they actually could now. So yeah, those are my quick thoughts on Spider-Man No Way Home. A big improvement over the previous 2 MCU Spider-Man films, and as of right now, I give the movie a 7 out of 10. As always, that score could go up or down, so stay tuned for my No Way Home versus video so you can get my final verdict. Conceptually, this movie had a very good idea, and I think they did a decent job at it, but it definitely could have been done so much better, and there are like a million plot holes in this film. In the end, I do wish that Sam Raimi would have directed this movie, because he understands the emotional core of Spider-Man the best out of all the directors in my opinion, plus most of these are his villains. He would have known how to handle the interactions between them much better, and they would have felt more authentic to how they were. And on a side note, I gotta say, it does sadden me that a kid sitting a couple rows down from me said that Peter's using his Peter tingle. I was thinking in my head, it's his spider sense. Damn, Marvel, you used that joke for too long and now kids are calling Spider-Man's spider sense his Peter tingle. Anyway, I did like this movie and I did have fun with it, as is evident of the score that I gave it. But stay tuned for the versus video, as I have a lot to say about this film and I will go into full details and spoilers in that video. Thanks as always for watching, guys. Comment below and let me know what you thought of Spider-Man No Way Home and what score you would personally give it. And as always, please give this video a thumbs up, as the more thumbs up and comments it gets, the more likely it will get recommended by YouTube's algorithm and it will really help my channel grow. Also, be sure to follow me on Instagram, as that's where you will get updates on my channel, as well as my quick thoughts on other movies and TV shows that I watch. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it, and I will see all of you very, very soon. Take care.